Welcome, everyone. We're so excited to kick off our Fall Science of Reading Week, Comprehension Connections, Building the Bridge Between Reading and Understanding. This week, we're hosting daily webinars at 3 p.m. Eastern and 12 p.m. Pacific to explore all things reading comprehension. It's going to be a great week, and as a bonus, everyone who attends any session live will get a certificate of attendance. If you're not able to make it live, you'll get the recording link for you to watch at your convenience and share with colleagues. Be sure to save your spot for the rest of the webinars at amplify.com/fall SOR webinars. And I'm going to throw that link in the chat so you have easy access to it. And we'll share it throughout too. So I'm just about to ask where everyone's joining from, so it might disappear quickly. So throughout the webinar, we do encourage comments in the chat and questions in the Q&A box. So to get us started, please let us know where you're joining from. My name is Laura Almazara. I'm on the literacy team here at Amplify, and I'm joining from sunny Phoenix. We have people from all over. Thank you all so much for joining us. Oh, they're coming in fast. Thank you all. And thank you for joining us for today's presentation hosted by our very own Susan Lambert. She's going to be talking about reading comprehension and what it exactly is. As a quick reminder, today's session is being recorded. We'll share out the recording link for you in an email later this week. And again, all of you here with us today will receive a certificate of attendance. So now I'd like to introduce Susan. Dr. Susan Lambert is the Chief Academic Officer of Literacy at Amplify and host of Science of Reading, the podcast. As a former classroom teacher, administrator, and curriculum developer, Susan has special interest in the increasing body of scientific research about how reading is best taught, turning theory into best practices that educators can use in the classroom, and showcasing national models of reading instruction excellence. As the host of Science of Reading, the podcast, Susan explores the increasing body of scientific research around how reading is best taught with top literacy experts from around the world. Welcome, Susan.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks for kicking us off. I was trying to watch in the chat where everybody was from, and I couldn't keep up. So it's amazing. Welcome, everybody. It's so great to be able to come to you from and just have you joining us from all over the country, and it looks like to me all over the world. So thank you. And like Laura said, we are kicking off this week of reading comprehension, and we're going to talk a little bit about what reading comprehension is. So today I'm going to give you like the big overview. That's what I feel like I'm really good at, is the big overview to sort of ground us in some principles of reading comprehension. And then throughout the week, you'll be lucky enough to hear from some other amazing folks, including Dr. Sonia Cabell and Haijin Huang for tomorrow for comprehension and knowledge building. You'll have a session on Wednesday about where and how to measure comprehension to drive improvement. That one's going to be fabulous. For those of you that are interested in middle school, comprehension in middle school is coming on Thursday. And then topping off the week, or closing out the week, I guess, is Dr. Julie Van Dyke, who's going to talk a little bit about the missing link in reading comprehension. I think that has a little something to do with syntax, so please come back and join us for that. Like Laura said, you will have access, if you've registered, you will have access to all of these after the session. So if you have to leave early, if you miss something, be sure to make sure that you register so that you can get those recordings. And she will, I think she said certificates of attendance too. So that's really amazing. Well, not to plug the podcast, but we're going to start off by plugging the podcast. I don't know if you have listened to these or if you're aware, but we have done two essential episodes, and one of them all about comprehension. Well, what is an essential episode? Well, the essential episodes are really diving into some of the information that we've gotten from past guests and sort of consolidating them in a way that you get introduced to an essential topic, right? Thus, the Science of Reading Essentials. And we recently released this special episode near the end of the last season, all about comprehension. If you haven't had a chance to listen yet, I think Laura is going to throw a link in the chat where you can listen to this episode. I'm going to pull some information from that episode today. This one also comes with a listening guide, a essentials listening guide, which is really fun because it will help you then walk through the essentials episodes, but also the guests that we have highlighted in the episodes and take you back to their episodes as well. So I really encourage you to grab that essentials episode if you haven't listened to it yet. And it's another one that will really usher you into this great big topic called comprehension. So right off the bat, before we get started, I know it's always awkward in a webinar to have this weird downtime for you to be doing something, but I'd love for you to grab either a paper and pencil or something that you can write this down. I want us to start by doing some thinking about reading comprehension, why it's important, and when students have it, when they have comprehension, what are they able to do? So I'm going to go on mute and I'm going to give you close to 2 minutes to start doing some thinking about this and writing it down for yourself. We're actually going to revisit this at the end, and I would love for you to revisit this throughout the week in terms of the things that you're hearing and learning. So I'm going to turn my timer on and I'm going to go on mute, and we are going to have this very awkward, almost 2 minute time for you to think about and answer this question. About 30 more seconds. All right, time's up. Thank you for indulging me in that. And for those of you that took the time to really get your thoughts down on paper, I think it will be really helpful. Webinars are so great, but when you just listen to the information and you don't interact with it, it's often hard to learn, right? So what we're trying to do is to use the principles of science of learning to help us understand and sort of recall. And again, build a base for what you're going to hear throughout the week, which I'm really excited about. All right, let's do this. Let's get started by talking about some foundational research. And I want to take us back to the National Reading Panel report. And, it dawned on me that as I was pulling this together, the National Reading Panel report came out in the year 2000. And so we very well may have attendees or folks that are in the classroom teaching right now that weren't even born when this report came out. And I think what's really important about going back to this report, even though we've had newer research and newer validations of things that are in this report, is that to understand how science grows and develops, it's really good to be able to have a foundation first. And so if you haven't read this report, Laura's going to throw in the chat a link to this, easily accessible. It's hundreds of pages long, but we're going to work through a little bit how we can sort of manage looking at this report. But this is the report where we get the big five. And if we were in person, I would ask everybody, what are the big five in reading instruction? And I know all of you would know their phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. This is the order they actually appear in the National Reading Panel report. And I can pretty much guess that this is probably the order that most of us know them in as well. So again, this report actually looked at 5 pillars, which we call the 5 pillars of reading instruction. And Great foundational research. Like I said, we're going to walk through it. The problem is that we've got all of these images now that talk about them as the five pillars. And these five pillars have a little bit of an unintended consequence here because it can give us, as Hugh Katz tells us, the false impression that comprehension is comparable to all these other skills, that all of these things are equally influential at all of the times in reading instruction, and it really misses the nuance and the complexity of what we're talking about in each one of these sort of elements. So, how do we sort of dig in and look at them? Well, if you go to the table of contents, you will see the chapters laid out. You'll see here there's chapter 2 about alphabetics. This is the place that we go to find about phonemic awareness instruction and phonics instruction. Like you can go to the introduction and the methodology if you want to. Essentially, what the methodology will tell you is they looked at all of these studies and they did a review and a meta-analysis, which is basically a big study of all of the studies to find out the impact that each of these things had in terms of reading outcomes. And so part 1 is phonemic awareness instruction. Go to the executive summary. All you have to do is read that executive summary to give you an overview of what the National Reading Panel report says about phonemic awareness instruction. Really, I encourage you to do that. Phonemic awareness instruction is a hot topic these days. Part 2, phonics instruction. Again, go to the executive summary, read what that looks like. There's a chapter all about fluency, and there's a chapter all about comprehension. I want to dive a little bit into this chapter about comprehension and sort of lay some framework or groundwork for you. So you remember I said that all of these chapters, they looked at a study of the study. So they did a meta-analysis. The problem with the comprehension chapter is they didn't do a formal meta-analysis because there was not enough research based on their parameters in the area of comprehension, but they did look at what was there and they sort of suggested some key themes related to comprehension. These 3 key themes will probably seem pretty intuitive to you. First of all, that comprehension is complex and it's an integrated process. We're going to unpack that a little bit. And we know that vocabulary plays a really key role in reading comprehension. The second theme is that comprehension involves active, interactive, strategic processes. That's a mouthful, but we're going to look at what that active process looks like and how some of these things interact with each other. And then there's another theme about teacher preparation and comprehension strategies. Teacher preparation, always, always, always super important. And we're going to dive in and dig into a little bit about comprehension strategies. So again, the reason that I sort of mention this is as we're digging into comprehension and you're starting to think about all the nuances and all the elements of reading comprehension, I really encourage you to go back to this foundational research and start there to give yourself an understanding of what comprehension looks like. The beginning of this document actually gives us a really great summary. And I love that it tells us that a reader can read a text to learn, to find out information, or to be entertained. And you can put yourself in this category, right? That's the reasons why we pick up a text and interact with it. And these various purposes of understanding require that the reader uses knowledge of the world, including language and print. Now, I highlighted those 2 words in orange. Those are my highlights because we're going to follow that thread a little bit, this idea of using your knowledge of language and print to help us make meanings of the text. So that means, so in last slide, we saw this, right? The reader, we're gonna orient ourselves to the reader. When we're thinking about reading comprehension, the reader is an important element in that, right? So that sounds like kind of a silly thing to say, but there are some cognitive processes that a reader must employ, elements that we have to make sure that are in place and strong in order to have a strength of reading comprehension. It wouldn't be a webinar with Susan Lambert or a presentation with Susan Lambert if we didn't use the simple view of reading. I know there's lots of models out there, but I always like to go back to the simple view of reading because it grounds us in a reminder of the cognitive capacities that need to be developed in order to be a skilled reader. Now, skilled reading is depth of comprehension, right? And we know that you have to have both word recognition and language comprehension in order to be a skilled reader. Now, this model has been around since the mid 80s. We are not saying that word recognition is the only thing. Of course, we know what you decode or what you recognize in terms of the words on the page have to be understood, and how well you understand them gives us a sense of your level of comprehension. Now, when you look at this model, this multiplication problem here, think of it as a static equation, meaning that I'm going to pick up a text and I'm going to read a text about finance. I like to use that one as an example because my husband was a former chief financial officer. My language comprehension or understanding of the language used in finance is not as strong as in other areas. I can still read that because I can recognize the words on the page, but I'm not as strong, or I cannot comprehend at the same level of depth as if I pick up a research article about early literacy, right? I have more understanding of the language used, the background knowledge to be able to have a depth of comprehension with that topic better than I do with the other topic. So when we think about this model, we can think about this as when you are reading this particular text, your language comprehension and your word recognition together will help you comprehend the text. The deeper your comprehension, the more automatic your word recognition, the better you are at comprehension. Now we're going to come back to this, but I'm going to do another quick plug here. And if you haven't had a chance to listen to the first episode of season 10 with Dr. Wesley Hoover, I really encourage you to do this because he explains this simple view, where it came from, how it can help us, how it can help us, what it does and what it doesn't do. And he reminds us that the simple view of reading doesn't say that reading is not complex. It's just that the complexities of reading are housed in these two factors. So if we're not thinking about word recognition as it relates to reading comprehension, we're missing out. We have to talk about how important that is as a gateway. And then there's this idea of comprehending the language. Dr. Hoover will give you a really great overview of the simple view of reading and how it relates to reading comprehension. Now, again, frameworks help us ground, and we want to be grounded to be able to help us think about some of these other things that are important. So, what are the complexities involved? As Dr. Hoover talks about, what are the complexities involved? Well, we're pretty much all aware of the strands of early literacy development, right? Scarborough's rope. Scarborough's rope recognizes that word recognition needs to become automatic. This idea that sounds, the letters that represent those sounds, form words. And the more automatic we are in these patterns between sounds, letters, and words, the better we're going to be able to be with our reading comprehension, right? I said it before, this is a gateway to comprehension. Reading comprehension, if you cannot lift the words off the page, you're not reading, and so you can't comprehend anything. And so this is a critical element of then the complexities of reading comprehension. Language comprehension. That is all that you know about language. What kind of background knowledge, both content knowledge and world knowledge, do you have? What's your vocabulary? How well do you understand syntax and how sentences are put together? This all starts in the oral language world, but as we continue to grow in our reading, impacts us more and more and more in the print environment. And so we'll find out that sentences become more complex when they're written down. Ideas are more complex, right? Because Written language is much more complex than oral language. Reading comprehension is more than just language comprehension. It's language comprehension on the page, which makes it much more complex. Now, I want to go back because I don't want to jump over this idea of word recognition, right, being the gateway in. Laura's going to put a link to this article in the chat. I really encourage you to read it if you have never read it. And this is one of those foundational articles from 1998. It was in the American Educator. And Cunningham and Stanovich talk about what reading actually does for the mind. So, when we're helping kids learn how to read, we're actually rewiring our brains, right? Like this idea that word recognition must be explicitly taught. You've probably heard that before. If not, you can hop on some of these podcasts and hear that. Word recognition is explicitly taught. And so when we're teaching that, we're helping students rewire their brains to be readers. But when we read, we also have cognitive consequences, and they say it this way. Reading has cognitive consequences that extend beyond the immediate task of lifting meaning from a particular passage. What they mean by that is there is some advantages to reading, and the sheer volume of reading that's done by a better reader has potential to provide an advantage. In orange, I write, reading a lot serves to develop these very skills and knowledge bases. What skills and knowledge bases? Well, the ones we saw in the previous slide, right? And early success at reading acquisition is one of the keys that unlocks a lifetime of reading habits. Essentially, what this article tells us is that we need to get kids reading early. We need to get them strong in word recognition and into print so that they can read and read and read and continue to develop then the skills of both automatic word reading, but even more importantly, the skills of that language comprehension, that knowledge base. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the reader, the cognitive capacities that need to be developed in order to interact with text, and then the cognitive capacities that develop as kids are interacting with text. So we have to talk a little bit about the text. And I think there is a lot of confusion about what text should be used with our early learners. And so to develop this idea of language comprehension, yes, we need to expose them to really rich literature. And this rich literature through read alouds will help them acquire knowledge and vocabulary. It will help them see the complexities of written text and hear those modeled and read out loud so they can start to understand the complexity that's involved there. Kids also need exposure to decodable texts. And why? They need to instructionally interact with these texts to build up their automaticity and word recognition. We don't use decodable text forever because we want to use them in the instructional environment. And then once kids get really automatic, any text is going to be, or words in those texts will be automatically recognized, but we want to make sure we use decodable text to help them build then and acquire that word recognition skills. By the time that they, sort of bring these things together, their word recognition is very automatic, and we're continuing to develop language and the complexity of that language in the written form. We want them to engage with text for various purposes, right? So we want them to enjoy things like Charlotte's Web and the science of breakable things, but we also need them to be able to interact with academic texts because they're going to be doing that third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, and beyond. So they have access to those texts and they're able to understand how they're put together and what purpose they're reading them for. So we have the reader and the cognitive capacities that we talked about. We have the text that we're expecting students to interact with. And then we have this interaction between both the reader and the text. So let's talk just a little bit about that interaction. So Comprehension actually entails the understanding of a written text, a process in which information from the text and the knowledge possessed by the reader act together to produce meaning. And so, what the reader brings to the text in terms of knowledge, whether that's vocabulary knowledge or world knowledge or knowledge of sentence structures, knowledge of the kind of text they're reading, the reader brings that to a text to help produce the meaning. And we're going to dig into both this idea of process and product. So, we all know that the fundamental goal of learning to read is to understand the text. Again, whether it's for enjoyment, for some practical purpose, or to learn or to find some information, right? You could read it. You could read a text for enjoyment, and you maybe not go down, the deep rabbit hole of deep comprehension. It's just sort of fun, and there's areas in that text you skim because, yeah, you didn't really want to read that part about that interaction with that, whatever characters, and you sort of move on. Or maybe you're reading a text because you want to learn how to put together this new gadget that you got for your kitchen. That's a very practical purpose. Or maybe you want to learn or find some information. So you're reading this research article because you really want to dig in and understand how to connect that information to the teaching practices in your school or in your classroom. Those are very different purposes for reading, and they're very different reading products or end goals, right? So you can think of the product, comprehension product, as the end goal of reading. But there's also this other element of comprehension called comprehension process, which is complex. And sometimes we're not sure how it has to be taught or improved, but giving attention to the processes and skills that need to be orchestrated during this comprehension process. And we're going to unpack some of those things and try to better understand what this process is. I think we all get this idea of comprehension products. This is all I did when I was a teacher in the classroom. I didn't really understand about this thing called comprehension process, but I did have things like, all right, we're going to read this text and then we're going to go back and see if we can find the main idea and write it in your own words and summarize it. Or can you go back and find two details in the text? Or let's read this longer text and see if we can identify a theme. Or maybe I gave my students a couple of texts and we did a comparison of the two texts, or maybe we compared and contrasted two characters in a story or analyzed a single character, or maybe we used something like a timeline to try to summarize the information that we read. All of these are great activities, right, for students to be engaged with text, but they're the end goal, right? And the assumption is that during the reading process, the kids have comprehended enough to be able to then accomplish these products or accomplish these tasks at the end. Well, I'm going to show you an example. We're going to talk a little bit about what can happen or what needs to happen as we're actually reading text or during the process of reading. So I'd like you to read these 3 sentences, and then I'm going to ask you a question about what you read. Carla forgot her umbrella, so she got very wet on the walk to school. Olivia gave her one to borrow for her walk home. After she got there, she was very dry and very grateful. So I'm going to actually pull up the chat here, and I want you to answer this question. Why did Carla get wet? So if you can throw your answer in the chat, I would love that. All right. I see some people say it was raining. Some people said she didn't have an umbrella. Both great answers, right? So if you said she got wet because she forgot her umbrella, you're right there in the text, right? Carla forgot her umbrella, so she got very wet. That is a right there answer, right explicitly outlined for us in the text. But for those of you that said, well, because it was raining, that is also a correct answer. But where did you see the word rain in that passage or those three sentences. You actually don't see it. You have to understand a few things to make that inference, right? You have to understand why you needed an umbrella. You'd have to understand what happens outside when you're walking to school that makes you get very wet. And so that was an inference that you actually made. And most of you made that inference automatically. You didn't have to think about that because you had enough background knowledge and vocabulary, like you understood what an umbrella was and you had that background knowledge about the weather to be able to make that association. Friends, that was three sentences, right? So what happened? What happens inside the brain to go from this very short passage of three sentences to being able to answer that question with two different answers? Turns out there is a whole lot that happens and a whole lot that you have to know in terms of connections to make that inference and to really understand or construct a strong mental model of what's happening. So if you think about our main characters here, we've got Carla. She's sort of the main player here in these three sentences. She forgot her umbrella. Where was she going? She was going to school. Olivia gave her one to borrow. So you have to understand what that means for her walk home. After she got there, who's the she in this sentence? You have to understand who the she was. And you have to understand got where. Well, you have to infer that when she got home, because it was the walk home, she was dry. So you see all these connections that need to be made in order to understand this passage. And it's kind of crazy when you think about it in three short sentences, all that's important in terms of helping us with our comprehension. You see the word mental model down here at the bottom? In those three sentences, you have to form this sort of mental model of what's happening in order to really come away with a depth of comprehension. And like I said, lots of associations you have to make here in order to understand that. So if you think about those three sentences and all the associations you have to make, and then you think about, let's say, 2 pages worth of text and what a reader has to do in terms of the process of reading those 2 pages of text to come out with a strong mental model, you get why this sentence level stuff is so important, right? Students who struggle with reading comprehension typically are weak in some of those language and literacy abilities that are required to create this mental model. What mental model? This mental model we're talking about right here. Your underlying language and literacy abilities. What do I mean by language and literacy abilities? Well, we can go back to the simple view of reading to think about our underlying language abilities. Those are things that, right? Oral language that develops first in oral language, all the things that we know and can talk about, all the words that we can use, all of the things that we've been engaged in and heard of in the oral language environment. Super important to early literacy development because it's directly related to reading comprehension. All those things you know about helps you when you're starting to make sense of text. And then what about literacy? Well, word reading skills, strong evidence that accurate and fluent word reading skills are important for good reading comprehension. So you have to be able to lift those words off the page, gateway into reading comprehension. You also have to understand those written words and understanding them in context. And there are some things that are really difficult for kids when we're talking about reading that print in context in a much more complicated sort of way. So skilled readers, we know comprehension is supported by those two capacities, always going back to those frameworks that help ground us. Language comprehension leverages language abilities to make meaning of text, and word recognition is helping secure that code knowledge so that we can have fluency and automaticity. I want to talk a little bit about both of these. Word recognition. Well, let's talk about language comprehension first. We often hear that language comprehension is the thing that develops naturally, right? Like we're born to be communicators. We're born to When we hear the words around us and hear the language around us, we start to use that language as well. Well, what we want to remember is that it's when we expose kids to more academic content, we need to leverage that language comprehension, but still there's some explicit instruction involved in helping kids develop more background knowledge and deeper vocabulary, and how sentences work together. And so even though it is a naturally developing process, we have to leverage it in explicit instruction to help kids grow in that comprehension. And then, of course, word recognition. We always say you can't put a kid in a room surrounded by books and think they're just going to be able to acquire that code. Very much explicitly taught. Word recognition is the thing that once we teach it, we don't have to go back and teach it, right? Once kids are secure with the code and they're automatic in word recognition, they can leverage all of that cognitive energy and capacity into language comprehension. Language comprehension, there's no limit on that, right? Sky's the limit. You can continue to learn new things, new words, put things together. And as long as you're a lifelong learner, your language is going to continue to grow. Going back to word recognition, securing the code, all kids don't need the same amount of practice to secure that code. Remember that too. So some kids are going to need a lot more practice than others. And why are we talking about that so much? Well, the reason I'm talking about it so much is you cannot have comprehension without having strong word recognition. I think we just released an episode of the podcast with Katie Pace Miles, who talks a lot about that, who talks a lot about orthographic mapping. So just a reminder, the strong evidence that accurate and fluent word reading skills are important for good reading comprehension. They are not the only thing, but they're almost table stakes, right? It's table stakes to be able to interact with text. In terms of language comprehension, I'm going to do something that's not best practice, which is give you a lot of words on the slides. But I want to do this on purpose because you're going to have a couple of opportunities and webinars this week to listen to some folks talk about knowledge and vocabulary. And what we know is that research clearly shows that how much readers understand about the text topic before they read it is a major factor in how much they understand while they're reading it and after they're reading it. And notice that Hugh Katz puts that while and after they read it. So both that process and that product. I've talked about this example before. If I picked up a text and read about finance, I'm not going to be able to engage in that text as easily as I would be able to engage in a text that I know a lot about. I like to use string theory as another example, right? If I picked up a text about any physics text at all, but for sure about string theory, I would have a really rough go of it in terms of reading it. I could probably plow through it and get a little bit of understanding of it, but not at the same level as somebody who was a physicist could get that. So keep that in mind that when we're asking students to read text, each individual text and the content of that text actually makes a difference in terms of what they know and what they bring to the text. More on that in tomorrow's webinar. The next one is, this is a great quote from Tim Shanahan. And so we know that if we lined up students and they did equally well on decoding, they all had the same kind of vocabulary, their executive functioning skills were essentially the same, but if they had variations in comprehension because of syntax, the kids who understand syntax comprehend better than the ones that don't. What do I mean by syntax? Syntax is all about sentence construction. So remember that 3 sentences about Carla, who forgot her umbrella and got wet? If you don't understand what's happening within those sentences and how the author constructed those sentences to communicate the meaning, you're going to miss either the inference or the direct meaning from those sentences. And so syntax is a really important thing for kids to be able to understand. The more complex the syntax, the harder it is to comprehend the text. And you know this as a reader too. When you read something, the sentences are really long. You can lose yourself in that complex syntax and often have to go back and reread. Syntax or sentence level is really important to comprehension. And you're going to hear more about that on Friday. And that's going to be a great presentation. So here's a bottom line about reading comprehension. And this comes from an article written by Student Achievement Partners. And Laura, again, is going to throw the link to this into the chat so that you have that right at your fingertips. Reading comprehension is not a thing. It's not a cluster of observable skills. It's actually something that exists in a reader's mind, right? Thinking about that mental model that you're creating, that schema that you're creating as you're reading the text. And the better or stronger that mental model, the better your comprehension. And scientists refer to this as representation. And we're going to look at this in just a minute. Before I flip over to this slide, I often say too that, I think for a long time, I viewed comprehension as an either or, right? When my third graders read this text, did they comprehend it? Yes or no? And comprehension isn't an either or. Comprehension comes on a continuum. And you've heard me allude to that throughout the webinar in that, when I read this text about string theory, or if I would read this text about finance, I can't comprehend that as deeply as if I read a text about something I already know. Now, if I wanted to learn more about string theory, I would read more and more and more texts, right? To be able to build my background knowledge. And I'd use some strategies to help me build that background knowledge. And the more I read, the more I'd learn, the easier it would be. But comprehension is actually building up of, right? Or a continuum of understanding or levels of representation. So Kim has this really fun model. And again, this is outlined in that Student Achievement Partners PDF, if you grabbed that. And there's different levels, and we're going to talk through these levels, and it's going to make sense. There's this surface level of understanding or representation. That's your ability to recognize the words automatically, right? This is the gateway into deeper comprehension. That's your word recognition skills. Really important. You have to be able to get a surface level understanding of the text. But that's only one level, right? We want kids to go deeper. We want to go deeper in our own reading. So sort of the next deeper level is then at the text base. So can you understand the basic message of the text or what's right there in the text? Remember the Carla forgot her umbrella and so she got wet? Those of you that answered, well, she got wet because she forgot her umbrella, that's getting right at the text space. We got the basic understanding. We understood what the three sentences were about, and we found that just right answer to that comprehension question. But really, we want kids to get even deeper than that in terms of their comprehension. And that's at what we call the situational model, or getting a full understanding of the entire text, how the ideas within that text relate to one another, and how they connect to the reader's current background knowledge, whether that's world knowledge or whether that's content knowledge. And so we really want to get kids all the way to the situation level. Now, are they going to get there in all the text we put before them? No, but this is the goal that we want to get to. We want to get them at that depth of understanding. Remember our Carla example? So if you think about this situation level or this mental model that's built, and you look at all these connections between the words and the ideas in which they represent, like Carla forgot her umbrella. We have to know who her is. There's a lot of complexity just in these three sentences. And again, getting students to understand the complexity within the text and the words that are used in the text at the syntax level or the sentence level helps them build a stronger mental model of that text. Okay, so we've talked about a bunch about comprehension, and I'm sure many of you are wondering, all right, Well, what about reading comprehension strategies? There's been a lot of talk about don't do strategies. Yes, do strategies. Where do strategies fit into all of this? Now, I think Laura's going to put a link to this article as well in the chat, and we're overloading you with links here, and that's crazy. And this one is also sort of a classic text about reading comprehension strategies in which Dan Willingham, who's a cognitive scientist, went back and looked at what do we know from the research about reading comprehension strategies. And what he found is that reading strategy programs. Now let's think about this. Reading strategy programs. They're programs that just taught reading strategies. The ones that were short were no more or less effective than longer programs. So what does this say? Yes, reading strategies are useful, and a brief instruction in the strategy themselves will actually help a student comprehend more, but we don't need to teach main idea in detail in isolation over and over and over and over again. Because the goal of reading is not to necessarily apply a strategy, right? But the goal of reading strategies are to help us get more engaged with the text. How do we better comprehend a text? We spend more time in that text, and using reading strategies will help engage the readers with the text, help them go back to revisit the text. But the text should always be the lead, not the reading strategies. And so reading strategies help us get down to a full understanding of the entire text, or help us get to that place where we can actually build a really strong mental model about what the text is telling us. So, do you hear my message? Reading strategies are important to engage reader with the text, but let the text lead. Okay, so I've given you a lot. I've talked a lot for about 45 minutes. What I'd like for you to do, and yes, I'm going to turn the timer on again. What I'd like for you to do is I'd like you to go back and revisit what you wrote at the beginning. I'm going to give you about another 90 seconds, and I want you to add to what you wrote at the beginning. So go ahead and get started. I'm going to go back on mute. Take about 30 more seconds. I'm looking through the Q&A while you're doing that. All right, let's finish up your last thought or writing and get it written down. I really do encourage you to carry this sort of idea through each one of the sessions that you're able to go to this week. And I think some of the questions in the Q&A also will be answered this week. So I'm going to start answering some of them before I sort of finish off here. There's some really, really great ones. There is one here that is a question about assessing comprehension, currently using Acadian's Orphan Maze. Kara or Kara, I don't know how you pronounce your name. Be sure to visit or listen to the assessment session. And so I think that one would be a great one for you to go to. It's a really big question about what does it mean to really assess comprehension. or are you assessing knowledge, or are you assessing vocabulary? So rather than me trying to explain that, there's going to be an hour-long session. I would love for you to attend that one. Another question, when a student has very strong oral language ability but struggles to lift the words off the page, such a good question. This is also related to those students that may have dyslexia. What do you do about that? Well, two things. First of all, you continue to develop that language ability. So I always encourage you that when we're working on word recognition, lifting the words off the page, you need to continue to develop that language development, right? You should still be exposing them to and talking about ideas and concepts and read aloud texts, all that. But if they're struggling to lift the word off the page, or if they have dyslexia, you need to give them more explicit instruction and more time and instruction. So there's no magic bullet to that, that having to teach this code recognition, practice that code recognition in context, and continue to have them practice and practice and practice. It needs to come in the core instruction. So in kindergarten and first grade, we're hitting that code knowledge really hard. As kids are doing that, you will discover those that need extra practice. We need to make sure we get them that extra practice, or give them, like I said, more intensity of the instruction, either in tier 2 or tier 3. Super important that they get strong and automatic with that in those first couple years of school. Best practices for 4th and 5th graders in comprehension. Man, this is such a big question, and I think it's a really great question. I would love, again, for you to attend. There's a middle school session this week that might help. But remember that comprehension is it's so big. So what part of comprehension? Are we doing some work at the syntax level to understand sentence level comprehension? Friday's webinar session will help you with that. Are we allowing our kids to have adequate background knowledge? Are we building that? So are we staying in these texts for some time so that they can actually develop that background knowledge and vocabulary? Are we supporting them with vocabulary development in context? And then sometimes in grades 4 and 5, they're still struggling with being automatic and fluent when they're reading. Are you allowing them to listen to some of this information on, either reading it aloud orally or doing some choral reading to make sure that they're actually getting at that comprehension? Again, understanding comprehension and the different elements of comprehension, or facets of comprehension. There is another, tomorrow's webinar will also be really good for that one. So you're going to learn a little bit more there. And I'm going to grab one more. Oh, there's another one about assessing comprehension. That's great. Here's a good one. Thinking about the complexity of syntax and the Carla example, would it be useful to create decodables with complex syntax, or is that too much load since decodables are inherently more geared at word recognition? I think that's a really good question. I think the goal of a decodable, remember, is to get kids very automatic in word recognition, but you could also talk about, even in a decodable, you can talk about simple syntax and how sentences are structured. And in the oral environment, so remember, you can do work in syntax when you're doing oral language development. You can have kids start to put together sentences or expand sentences. So think about developing that on the language comprehension side and accessing that with oral activities, so that when they get then to more complex texts, they can actually work with those complex texts. Again, the syntax with Dr. Julie Van Dyke on Friday will be amazing for that. If you can't attend it, be sure to listen to the recording. Okay, I would love to answer more questions, but we are running out of time. I want to end with a couple of things. First of all, a couple of things from our Essentials episode on comprehension. A reminder from Dr. Sharon Vaughn that comprehension is an outcome. It's a process, but it's also an outcome. It's based on being able to read words accurately. Got to have that down. Know what those words mean. Got to have that down. Have enough background knowledge to be able to comprehend and to make some inferences. Remember, you made that inference about Carla getting wet because it was raining, and that was automatic. Sharon Vaughn's episode is amazing in terms of comprehension. And then Hugh Katz reminds us that comprehension is not a single thing, which is the problem. We want it to be a single thing, but it also depends on what you're reading and why you're reading it. So I hope that you're starting to see now that how do we solve comprehension is a much bigger question than how do we solve word recognition. Word recognition is sort of under this umbrella of comprehension, and comprehension is a really big, complex thing. I've mentioned our webinars. Here they are again. Take a screenshot if you want to. If you haven't registered for all of them, register for all of them so you can at least go back and listen to the recordings. And know that reading comprehension is so important to us here that we are dedicating season 10 of the podcast all about things that are related to and breaking down all that goes into reading comprehension. 2 episodes have dropped. The one that I mentioned with Dr. Hoover, all about the simple view of reading, and the second one with Dr. Katie Pace Miles, all about orthographic mapping or how to develop word automaticity with students. More to come on that. So thank you again for joining. Laura, I don't know if you want to jump on here at the end and have something to say to us, but this has been amazing.
It certainly has. Thank you so much, Susan, for everything. As you could probably tell between the activity in the chat and the Q&As, the questions in the Q&A, people were very interested in what you were sharing. So thank you so, so much for opening up this incredible week for us. And to all of you who joined us today, thank you for taking the time, even if you weren't able to join for the full session. As we shared earlier, every session this week is being recorded, and you'll get a recording link via email. And for every session you attend live, you'll also get a certificate of attendance. You'll get those in the next couple of days. We will also be sharing all the resource links that were shared in the chat on our resources page, which we'll share out next week. Thank you again so much for joining us. I'm going to put the link to the rest of the webinars in the series in the chat once more so you can see what else we have going on this week and register for anything you missed. And just one last reminder, tomorrow's session is going to be presented by Dr. Sonia Cabell and Dr. Haijin Huang. It's going to be about comprehension and knowledge building. It'll be the same time, same place, 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Pacific, and we really hope to see you there. Thank you again so much, Susan, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank
Take
you
care.
all.